The marble corridor stretched before her like a sentence she had finally learned how to end. Sable Windfair walked with her head lowered and her shawl pulled tight, counting the seams in the polished floor because counting kept her hands from shaking. 6 seams to the western archway, 12 more to the servants' stair, 41 steps from the stair to the side gate where a horse stood saddled in the dark, paid for with the last of her grandmother's silver. She had rehearsed this walk for 9 nights. Above her, the great chandeliers of Hyrook Palace burned at full brightness for the first time in 7 years. The convocation of the 5 crowns had begun at sunset. Every noble house from the Riverlands to the Salt Cliffs had crowded into the throne hall. Drums had been beating since the 2nd hour. The whole palace pulsed with celebration, with politics, with the kind of attention that left the corridors empty. That was the only reason Sable had a chance. She passed beneath a bronze relief of the first Wolf King and forced herself not to look up. Looking up meant remembering. Remembering meant slowing. Slowing meant being seen. She would not be seen. Not tonight. Her left hand pressed against the inside of her cloak, fingers curled protectively around the small leather pouch hidden in the lining. Inside the pouch sat a single object. A thin silver disc the size of a coin, etched with a crescent and a sigil no one in the kingdom of Marrowvale was supposed to recognize. It had been pressed into her palm 3 nights ago by a hooded woman in the kitchens, a stranger who had wept while she did it, and whispered 7 words that had not let Sable sleep since. Leave before the moon turns, or die. She had failed to convince herself the warning was a lie, because the silver disc burned faintly when she touched it, and because the small life she carried beneath her ribs had begun to twist at night as if it could feel something coming, and because she had finally understood that the man who slept beside her in stolen hours was not a man she could protect. Not from what was hunting her. Not from what hunted her because of him. The thought of him made her stop walking. Sable closed her eyes for one long breath and let herself remember the last time he had held her face in his hands. 4 nights ago. The window of his private chamber had been open to a sky thick with stars, and he had pressed his forehead to hers and called her by a name only he used, a soft, small name in the old tongue that meant the thing my heart returns to. He had told her, voice rough, that the convocation would be the last test, that he would name her in front of every noble house and let them choke on their objections. She had believed him. She had believed him the way a drowning woman believes a thrown rope. But 3 nights ago she had learned what the 5 crowns intended to demand of him. She had heard it through a vent in the steward's chamber while she was carrying linens. The price of unity was a marriage, and the marriage they wanted was not to her. The price of her staying was not heartbreak. It was a knife between her ribs while she slept, paid for by men who could not afford the inconvenience of a king with a secret. She was not running because she did not love him. She was running because she did. Sable opened her eyes and started walking again. Faster now. The drums above had shifted into a deeper rhythm. The rhythm that meant the naming of houses was beginning. The part of the ceremony that would hold him on the high dais for the next full hour. She had timed her flight to that hour. She turned the corner toward the servants' stair, and froze. A man stood at the foot of the stair with his back to her, pulling on a glove. He wore the green sash of the palace stewards, but his shoulders were too broad for a steward, his stance too still. He was waiting. Sable stepped backward slowly. The silver disc in her cloak had grown hot enough to feel through 3 layers of cloth. Her stomach tightened with a small sharp kick, as if the child too understood that they could not pass this man. There was another way down. The East Tower. It would cost her 10 minutes she did not have, but it was empty. It was unwatched. And it would deliver her to the same gate by a longer road. She turned and ran on the balls of her feet. Her cloak gathered close. She did not see the woman in dove-colored silk who stepped from a doorway behind her and watched her go. She did not see the slow, private smile that crossed that woman's painted mouth. She did not hear the soft instruction murmured to a page boy, 3 words long, that sent him sprinting toward the throne hall by a different stair. The east tower was as empty as she had hoped. Sable descended 2 flights with her hand on the rail, and her breath pressed flat against her teeth. The disc in her cloak burned. The child kicked again, harder this time, and she pressed her free hand to her belly and whispered, "Hush, hush, my brave one. Almost there." She reached the bottom of the tower and pushed open the small wooden door that led into the lower colonnade. The lower colonnade ran along the side of the throne hall. She had forgotten. Or she had not let herself remember. The great doors of the throne hall stood 20 paces to her right, flung wide for the ceremony, and through them spilled a river of golden light, a wash of music, a crush of voices. 500 nobles, 200 guards, her king on the high dais in his ceremonial black, and the rows of expectant faces waiting to hear which house he would bind himself to before the stars rose to their highest. She kept her head down. She kept walking. The colonnade was shadowed. The guests inside were not looking outward. The gate was 60 steps further on, and then she would be free. She would be gone. She would be... The drums stopped, all at once, as if a hand had closed around them. The whole hall fell silent in the same breath, 500 voices dropping into nothing, and the silence rolled out into the colonnade and broke against Sable's back like a wave. She did not stop walking. She could not stop walking. If she stopped walking, she would die in this corridor. Behind her, from inside the throne hall, a voice rose. His voice. Not the voice he used in the stolen hours. The other voice. The voice that had bent 5 kingdoms to a single treaty. The voice that had ended the river wars with one sentence. The voice that her body recognized before her mind did, because every nerve she owned belonged to the man who used it. He spoke one word. He spoke her name. Not the small name, not the secret name. Her real name, her full name. The name no one in this palace was supposed to know belonged to a kitchen girl with a torn slipper and a child she had not yet announced. Sable Winfair. It carried through the open doors. It carried through the colonnade. It carried into the courtyard beyond, where the horse she had paid for was already pawing the cobbles. It carried into every corner of Hyrook Palace where a wolf could hear. And in the silence that followed, while 500 nobles turned as one toward the open doors, Sable Winfair stood in the lower colonnade, with her cloak gathered around the secret she carried and understood, with a clarity that gutted her that she was not going to make it to the gate. She did not turn. Turning would be confirmation. Turning would be surrender. Turning would mean walking back toward a man who had just, in one word, in one breath, in front of every noble house in 5 kingdoms, spent everything he had been protecting to keep her alive. She did not turn. She ran. The shawl tore from her shoulders on the first bend of the colonnade, and she let it go. Her slippers slapped the stone too loudly, and she did not care. The drums had not started again. The hall behind her had not yet erupted. She had the seconds between the dropping of his voice and the rising of the noise to clear the colonnade, to clear the courtyard, to clear the gate. And after that, no amount of running would matter because every wolf in Hyrook would have her scent. She made it to the courtyard. The horse was where the stable hand had promised, hitched to a post in the shadow of the kitchen wall. Sable's hands were shaking too hard to untie the lead. She forced them to be still. She fumbled the knot. The silver disc in her cloak was burning so hot now she could feel it through the leather pouch. She got the knot loose. She got her foot in the stirrup. She got her body across the saddle. Behind her, from the throne hall, the noise finally arrived. It was not the noise of nobles arguing. It was the noise of a bond unsealing in public. A long, low, structural groan, as if the palace itself had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. then voices, then chairs scraping. Then a single guard shouting an order that was instantly countermanded by a deeper voice she would have recognized in her grave. Let her go. She heard it through the open doors, through the courtyard, through the bone behind her ear. Let her go. No one follows. No one. I will tear out the throat of any wolf who crosses that gate before I reach it myself. Sable kicked her heels and the horse lunged forward. She did not look back. She made it through the gate. She made it down the carriage road. She made it past the two outer guard posts where the men on duty stared at her without challenge, because they had heard the king's order ride out behind her on the wind. She made it to the lowland fog at the foot of the palace hill, and the fog took her, and the disk in her cloak finally cooled. And somewhere far behind her, a king stood on a high dais with his hands clenched at his sides, and his amber eyes fixed on the empty doorway through which the only thing he had ever wanted had vanished. He had not stopped her. He had freed her. She did not understand yet why that mattered. She would have years to understand. The first time he had spoken to her, she had been 16 years old and he had been newly crowned, and she had been kneeling in the herb garden gathering thyme for the cook, and had not heard him approach, because he moved on bare feet when he was alone. He had stopped beside her and said, "That one is bitterthorn, not thyme. It will spoil the broth." And she had looked up to correct whoever was foolish enough to teach her about her own herbs, and she had seen the king of Marrowvale crouched in the dirt beside her, with his sleeves pushed up, and a smudge of soil on his jaw, and she had forgotten how to speak. He had laughed. Not the king's laugh. A boy's laugh. "I worked a kitchen garden for 2 years before my father died," he had said. "Some habits do not unlearn." And he had taken the bitter thorn out of her basket with his own hand, and tossed it into the compost, and walked away whistling. 3 weeks later she had been carrying water through the lower colonnade, and he had stepped out of a doorway and said her name, and she had nearly dropped the bucket, and he had caught her wrist to steady her, and had not let go for a long second. The first stolen hour had come a month after that. The mark had come 6 weeks after that. It sat low on her hip. A small, dark print no bigger than a thumbnail, in the shape of a crescent bracketed by 2 stars. He had pressed it into her skin with his teeth on a midsummer night, while the wind moved the curtains of his private chamber, and he had whispered, "This is the only oath I will ever swear without my counsel's permission, and it is to you." She had been right to believe him. That was the part she had not let herself understand until tonight. Riding through the lowland fog with the silver disk finally cool and the child quiet in her belly. He had not lied. Not once. He had not chosen the marriage they wanted. He had refused it in the only way that could not be undone. He had given her his life by giving her name. Because once 5 kingdoms knew the king of Marrowvale had a hidden mate, they would tear his palace apart looking for her, and they would not stop. And the only thing keeping her alive would be distance. And the only thing keeping him alive would be the fact that no one could reach her through him, because he did not know where she was going. He had not stopped her at the gate. He had freed her. And he had condemned himself to whatever the 5 crowns would do to a king who had just refused their treaty in front of their own faces. Sable bent forward over the horse's neck and pressed her wet face into its mane and rode harder. She did not see the second rider on the ridge above the fog road, hooded, motionless, watching her pass. She did not see the small gray bird that lifted from the rider's wrist and arrowed back toward Hyruk with a slip of folded paper in its claws. She did not hear the soft, amused voice of the woman in dove-colored silk reading that paper an hour later, or the single sentence she spoke to the page boy waiting at her elbow. "Find her, quietly, and bring me what she carries." Sable rode on into the dark, and behind her, in a palace lit too brightly for a night that had ended in disaster, the hunt for her had already begun. The town of Marsh did not ask questions of women who arrived alone. It was a salt-flat town at the edge of the hollow sea, 2 weeks' hard ride south of Hyruk, the kind of place where every second household kept a daughter who had come from somewhere else and would never say where. No one cared who you had been before. They cared whether you could work. Sable could work. She had arrived in Cindermarsh half-starved, half-frozen. The horse sold 3 towns back for passage on a salt barge, the silver disc sewn into the hem of her cloak. She had told the harbor mistress she was a widow from the river country. She had given the name Wren Thessaly, which had been her grandmother's name. The harbor mistress had looked at her belly, and at her hands, and at her eyes, and had asked no questions. She had pointed up the lane to a low stone cottage with a slate roof, and had said, "The roof leaks in the eastern corner. The well is good. Pay me a copper a month, and we will pretend you have always been here." That had been 4 months ago. Sable, who was now Wren to everyone in Cindermarsh, had become the woman the salt pan workers came to when their wives went into labor, when their children burned with fever, when their old fathers coughed blood into the rags. She delivered babies. She splinted broken fingers. She accepted payment in eggs, in salt, in mended wool. She did not accept coin. Coin could be traced. The child had been born at the turning of the autumn moon. A boy, small but fierce, with a head of dark hair that startled the midwife from the next village over. The midwife had set the boy in Sable's arms and had said, with the careful neutrality of a woman who had seen too much, "His eyes will change in the first week. They always do." His eyes had not changed. They had been amber from the moment he opened them. Amber like the inside of a candle flame. Amber like the eyes of the man who had given her her name in front of 5 kingdoms and then let her go. She had named the boy Callum, after a saint in her grandmother's old book, who had walked into the sea to save a drowning fisherman and had walked back out alive. She had told no one in Cindermarsh what his eyes meant. He was 4 months old now. He was sleeping in the basket beside the hearth on the evening the bond began to wake. It started in her hip. Sable was kneading bread on the long wooden table by the window, her sleeves pushed up, and the salt wind coming through the cracked shutter and stirring the herbs that hung from the rafters. The dough was tough, and she was thinking about nothing. The mark on her hips stirred. She had felt it stir before. Every night for 4 months it had ached faintly, a distant pull, like a string tied to a star she could not see. She had grown used to it. She had stopped touching it. Tonight the mark was not aching. Tonight the mark was singing. She straightened from the bread with flour on her wrists and pressed her hand flat against her hip through her dress. The skin beneath her palm was warm, not feverish. Warm in the way a sunlit stone is warm. She stood very still in her kitchen and listened, because for the first time in 4 months, she had the feeling that something on the other end of the string had finally sat up and looked back at her. She could feel him. Not see him. Not hear him. Feel him. A presence, distant but unmistakable, a low banked heat she would have known in any darkness. The basket by the hearth made a small soft sound. Sable turned. Her son was awake. He had not cried. He never cried. He was lying on his back, with his small fists open at his shoulders, and his amber eyes were fixed on her face with an intelligence that no 4-month-old child should have possessed, and he was smiling. A small, private smile, the kind that belonged on a much older face, the kind that belonged on his father's face when he had crouched in an herb garden and laughed at a kitchen girl about bitter thorn. He knew. She did not understand how he knew, but she knew that he knew. The bond she felt in her hip, he felt too. He had been made inside it. Sable went to her knees beside the basket and gathered him out of it, and he made a small, contented noise and pressed his face into the side of her neck, and she sat on the floor of her kitchen with her son in her arms and her cheek pressed to his soft, dark hair and let herself, for the first time in 4 months, weep without shame. "He is alive," she said into her son's hair. "Your father is alive. I did not know. I did not let myself know." The mark on her hip pulsed once, gently, like a hand laid briefly over hers. The knock on the door came an hour later. It was a soft knock. 3 taps. Sable was on her feet before she had decided to stand. She set Callum back into his basket. She wiped her face on her sleeve. She crossed the kitchen and lifted the heavy iron poker from beside the hearth. She lifted the latch. A boy stood on her threshold. He could not have been more than 10 years old. He was barefoot. His hair was wet from the salt mist. He was holding a small folded square of parchment in both hands, the way a child holds something he has been told is precious, and he was looking up at her with an expression that did not belong on a child's face at all. It was the expression of someone who had been told to memorize a face. "Mistress Wren?" the boy said. "Yes." He held out the parchment. She did not take it. "Who sent you?" "A lady," the boy said. "She gave me a copper. She said I was to put it in your hand and then run home and forget I had been here." "What did she look like?" "She wore pearl," the boy said. "And she smelled like roses, but the roses were old." Sable's hand closed on the doorframe. She took the parchment from the child's outstretched fingers and stepped backward into her kitchen and shut the door before he had even turned to run. She sat down hard on the bench beside the table. She unfolded the parchment. The handwriting was small and elegant and absolutely steady. There were only 4 lines. "Wren Thessaly of Cinder Marsh. The boy in the basket has his father's eyes. That is a problem for both of us. I will arrive on the next tide. Do not run. You will not outrun me twice." There was no signature. There did not need to be one. Sable sat in her kitchen with the letter open on her knees and her son sleeping in his basket, and the mark on her hip humming with a presence she had only just learned to feel again. And she understood, with the same clarity she had felt 4 months ago in the lower colonnade of Hyrook Palace, that whoever had been hunting her had finally found her. The next tide was at dawn. She did not run. She thought about it for the long hour she spent sitting on the bench beside her kitchen table with the letter open on her knees and her son sleeping 4 feet away. She thought about walking out of Cinder Marsh on her own 2 feet, with Callum bound to her chest in a length of mended wool. She thought about the road north into the moor country. And then she thought about the woman who had written, "You will not outrun me," twice in a hand so steady it had not even smudged the ink. And Sable understood that she had already chosen. She would not run. She had run once, from a palace, in a hurry, with no plan, and it had cost her 4 months of sleeping with her hand on the iron poker. A second time, she would meet what was coming on her own threshold, with her son in his basket, and her healer's knife on the table, and the silver disc finally taken out of the lining of her cloak and laid where she could see it. She unpicked the stitches with shaking fingers. The disc came out into her palm, warm. It had cooled while she rode through the lowland fog, and it had stayed cool through 4 months of leaking roof and salted bread. It had only just begun to warm again tonight. In the same hour, the bond on her hip had begun to sing. She turned the disc over in her hand and looked at the sigil etched on its back, the sigil she had never let herself learn to read. She knew now that the woman who had pressed this disc into her hand in the laundry steam had not been a stranger. The woman had been a warning, and the warning had not come from her enemies. Dawn arrived the way dawn arrives on the salt flats. Slowly, sideways, the color of old pearl. Sable stood at her cracked shutter with Callum on her hip and watched the long, flat line of the hollow sea turn from black to slate to silver. She had not slept. She had bathed. She had braided her hair the way her grandmother had braided it, in a single thick rope down her back. She had put on her plainest gray dress and her cleanest apron, and over the apron she had tied the leather healer's belt with the small bone-handled knife in its sheath. It would not save her. She wore it anyway. The first carriage came up the lane at the 5th hour. She heard the wheels before she saw it. There were no wheeled carriages in Cinder Marsh. A wheeled carriage on the lane to her cottage meant only one thing, and Sable stood at her window with her son on her hip and watched the black lacquered shape come slowly up the rise out of the salt mist with two outriders pacing it on either side, and she did not move. The carriage stopped at her gate. A man in a high-collared green coat stepped down from the driver's seat and opened the carriage door, and a woman in pale pearl silk stepped out onto the salt-pale lane. She was the kind of woman whose age refused to settle. Her hair was the color of polished pewter, drawn back into a tight knot. Her hands were gloved in soft pearl leather. "Mistress Wren," the woman called. Her voice carried easily across the small front garden. "May I come in? I have traveled a very long way." Sable opened her door. She did not say anything. She did not invite her in. She simply opened the door and stood in it with her son on her hip and her hand on the iron poker, and let the woman in pearl silk walk up the stone path in her own time. The woman stopped at the threshold and looked at Sable, and at the boy, and at the boy's eyes, and her mouth softened a fraction. "He is exquisite," the woman said. "You will not touch him." "I have no intention of touching him. May I sit?" Sable stepped back from the doorway. She did not put down the poker. The woman in pearl silk walked into Sable's kitchen and looked at the herbs hanging from the rafters, and at the silver disc lying in the center of the table, and she did not flinch at the disc. She sat down at the bench across from where Sable stood and waited. "Who are you?" Sable said. "My name is Maren Vosich," the woman said. "I am the High Mistress of the Pale Court. I am the woman who has been trying to keep your king alive for the past 4 months, and I am the woman who arranged for a stranger to put that disc in your hand. And I have come here this morning because the people who want him dead have finally located you, and they will arrive in this town in less than 6 days." Sable did not move. The kitchen was very quiet. "You wrote that I would not outrun me twice," Sable said. "I needed to be certain you would not be gone when I arrived. Forgive me. I have spent 30 years of my life telling truths in ways that frightened people into doing the right thing. You said the boy was a problem for both of us." "He is." "How?" Maren looked at the silver disc on the table. "Because the disc you carry," she said, "is a pale court oath piece, and the sigil on its back is the seal of the High Mother, and the High Mother has not given an oath piece to a foreign-born woman in 400 years. I had it placed in your hand 3 nights before the convocation because by then I already knew what you carried, and I knew what was being prepared for you in your own chamber, and I had no other way of warning you that did not betray me to the crowns." She lifted her gray eyes to Callum's face. "And there it is," she said softly. "In your arms, with his father's eyes." Sable's hand tightened on the poker until her knuckles ached. "You will not have him." "Mistress Winfair," Morene said, and the use of Sable's true name in her own kitchen was a small, precise blow. "I do not want your son. I want your son to grow up. The 5 crowns want him to die before his first winter ends. You are going to need to choose very quickly which of us you would prefer to." She stopped. Her head turned, very slightly, toward the window. The bond on Sable's hip flared so hard and so fast, she nearly dropped the poker. Maren was on her feet in the same instant, faster than a woman of her bearing should have been able to move. "They are early," she said. "Take the child, take the disc, go to the cellar, now." "Who?" "The men who want your son dead. They are already in your garden. Move." Sable moved. She had Callum bound to her chest in 3 breaths with the length of mended wool. She had the disc in her fist. She had the poker in her other hand and the bone-handled knife at her belt, and she was at the cellar trap before Maren had finished crossing the kitchen. And she got the trap open and her foot on the first rung and her head below the lip of the floor when the front door of her cottage came off its hinges. She did not see what came through it. She heard Maren say one word in a language Sable did not know, and the word was not loud, but it shook the rafters of the cottage. And then she heard a sound like cloth tearing in slow motion combined with the breath of a very large animal, and then a man screamed. Sable pulled the trap closed over her head. She climbed down into the dark of her own cellar with her son strapped to her chest and the disc burning hot in her fist. And above her, in the kitchen, the sound of cloth tearing went on, and was joined by men's voices, by the snap of something heavier than a chair. She reached the cellar floor. She stood in the dark with her hand pressed to Callum's small back, and she felt the bond on her hip pulse in a rhythm that was no longer a hum, but a full, hard, coming toward her drumbeat. And she understood that the king of Marrow Vale had been close enough to the salt flats to hear when his bond began to sing, and he was no longer waiting. He was running. Above her, in her broken kitchen, a man's scream cut off mid-breath, and the cottage went silent. A long beat passed. Then the cellar trap lifted, slowly, from above. Sable raised the poker. Moreni's pale face appeared in the square of light, smudged with something dark across one cheekbone, her gray hair half undone from its knot, and her gray eyes had gone the color of moonlit water and were not, Sable saw with a small late shock, entirely human. "Come up," the high mistress of the pale court said quietly. "It is over. For now. And there is something you need to see before he gets here." The kitchen looked as if a storm had walked through it on two legs. The long wooden table was on its side. The herbs that had hung from the rafters lay in green tangles across the flagstones. The window over the sink was broken outward. There were 3 bodies on the kitchen floor. She did not look at them closely. Maren stood in the middle of the wreckage with her gloves tucked into the sash of her gown, and the dark smear across her cheekbone was already fading, the way a bruise fades on a wolf. Her eyes had returned to gray. "They were 3, Maren said. "Plus the driver, in the lane. Pale Court trained, but not Pale Court loyal. Bought men. The Crowns are using mercenaries from my own training houses against me now." Sable set Callum's basket upright on the hearth. She lifted him out of the wool sling and laid him in it, and he watched her with his amber eyes and did not cry. "You said there was something I needed to see." "Yes." Maren's voice was gentle now. "Sit down, Mistress Winfair. Please." Sable did not sit. She stood beside the basket with one hand on its rim. Maren reached into the front of her gown and drew out a small folded square of oilcloth. She unwrapped it on the only patch of the table that was still upright. Inside the oilcloth was a single piece of folded parchment, sealed in dark wax. The seal was a wolf's head crowned with a crescent. It was the king's private seal. "This was given to me 4 nights ago," Maren said, "by a man who rode his horse to death to deliver it. He arrived at the Pale Court at dusk, and was dead in his saddle by midnight. The letter is addressed to you. He wrote it the night the bond on your hip woke. He felt it wake, the same hour you did, and he understood at last that his wolf could find you whether his men could or not. He gave it to a Pale Court courier and asked me, in the body of it, to put it in your hand the moment I judged it safe. I have judged it safe." Sable picked up the parchment. The wax was unbroken. The seal was perfect. The handwriting on the front, in dark gray ink, was a hand she had only seen twice in her life. It said, "To the woman whose name I had to spend in order to keep her alive." Sable sat down. She broke the seal. She unfolded the single sheet of parchment. She read what he had written 4 nights ago, in a palace he was no longer certain he could hold. "If you are reading this, the High Mistress has found you, and you are alive, and the small life you were carrying when you left is alive too. And these 3 things together are more than I have allowed myself to ask for in any prayer in 4 long months. I will not waste your time with apology. Apology is for men who have done something they could undo. I did the only thing I could do in the only window I had to do it in. And if I could go back to the dais, I would do it again. And you would hate me for it again, and I would deserve it again. I want you to know what I was watching while you ran. I was watching the 4 lords of the 5 crowns who did not turn toward the doors when I named you, because the 4 who did not turn were the 4 who had already been told that a kitchen girl named Sable Winfair carried my mark and my child, and they were the 4 who had paid the men who were going to be in your chamber within the hour. I named you because if I had not named you, you would have been dead before midnight. Naming you cost me the treaty. It cost me the throne, eventually, because the 5 crowns will not let me keep it. It bought you the months you have had, which were not enough, but they were all I had. Do not come back. I write that with my whole heart. My love. Not yet. Not until the High Mistress sends you word. The Pale Court is the only force in 5 kingdoms older than the crowns, and Mireni Vosic is the only person alive who can move you in the open without getting you killed. I am coming. I am not coming yet. I am coming when she tells me it is time. Until then, I am holding the palace for as long as I can hold it, and I am holding my wolf for as long as I can hold him, because if I let him out, he will run for you, and I will lead every blade in the crowns to your door. The mark on your hip is mine. The child is mine. The name I spent in the throne hall was mine to spend. None of these things are negotiable. Until then, you are not alone. You have never been alone. Every time the mark on your hip warms, that is me, refusing to let go. Yours, in this life, and whatever follows it, Aldrich. His name was Aldrich. She had known that, of course. The whole kingdom knew that. Aldrich of House Marrowvale, 16th of his line. She had only never, in all the stolen hours and the one mark and the one child between them, heard him say it about himself in her presence, because in her presence he had been the boy in the herb garden, and a king did not speak his own name in the dark to a kitchen girl. He had signed it for her now, because he had understood that if she ever read it, she would already be on her way back to him, and she would need to know what to call him when she arrived. Sable folded the letter very carefully into quarters. She pressed it to her mouth. She did not cry. She had cried last night. She simply sat on her bench in the wreckage of her kitchen with the letter pressed to her lips and let the bond on her hip burn as hot as it wanted to, and somewhere in his own dark hour, she felt him feel her feel him, and he steadied, the way a flame steadies when a hand is cupped around it from the windward side. Maren was watching her with her hands folded in her lap. He has been holding the palace alone, Mireni said quietly. Against the crowns, against the cliff lords, against 3 separate poisonings that I caught, and one that I did not. He has not slept more than 4 hours together in any of those 4 months. He is the most powerful alpha currently breathing on this continent, and he is also the most exhausted living creature I have ever stood in a room with. He was coming for me. He was. The bond on your hip woke last night. It woke his too. He left the palace at dusk yesterday with 12 riders and the last 6 wolves who will still bleed for him, and he will be in this town by tomorrow's dusk. Sable pressed her hand to her hip. The mark beneath her palm was hot enough to feel through the dress. What do we do? Mireni stood up. She crossed the kitchen and stood over Callum's basket, and she did not touch the boy, but she looked down at his amber eyes for a long moment with something in her face that was almost, but not quite, awe. We make this cottage indefensible by tonight, Mireni said. We move you and the child to the Salt Pan Chapel at the edge of the town, which I have already prepared. We wait for him there, and when he arrives, Mistress Winfair, you and I and your king sit down together at one table and we have the conversation the 5 crowns have spent 4 months trying to prevent, because there is a thing about your son that he does not yet know, and he needs to hear it from me before he hears it from anyone else. Sable looked at her. What thing? Maren lifted her gray eyes from the basket. Your son, she said, is not the heir to one throne, Mistress Winfair. He is the heir to two, and the second is the one your king does not yet know I have spent 30 years guarding. The Salt Pan Chapel sat at the northern edge of Cinder Marsh on a low rise where the wind came hardest off the hollow sea. It was older than the town. The Salt Flat people said it had been there before the salt, that it had been a fisherman's shrine when the sea came further inland. Sable had walked past it twice a week for 4 months and had never gone inside. The door had always been shut. The single small bell in the tower had never rung. Maren opened the door with a key she drew from inside the cuff of her glove. The lock turned without sound. Inside, the chapel was warm. Not the warmth of a fire. There was no fire. There was no hearth. The walls were bare stone, the floor was bare stone. The single narrow window above the altar was glassless and let in a long, pale stripe of late afternoon light. And yet the air inside was warm in the way Sable's hip was warm, in the way the disk had been warm in the lining of her cloak. The chapel was alive. Sable stopped 3 paces in with Callum in his sling. It is a node point, Maren said behind her. One of 7 on this continent. The Pale Court built our court on top of the largest of them. You and I and the man who will arrive tomorrow at dusk are the only 3 people currently breathing who know where the door is. She closed the door. The lock turned itself. What is a node point? A place where the bond between things is thinner, where a child like yours can sleep safely while the world outside tears itself apart looking for him. He will not be found inside this chapel, not by scent, not by sight, not by oath piece. It is the safest building in 5 kingdoms, and you and the boy will sleep here tonight. Sable looked down at her son in the sling. Callum was awake. He had not slept since they had come up out of the cellar. His amber eyes were taking in the bare stone walls and the long pale stripe of light from the high window, and he was, again, smiling. He liked the chapel. The chapel, somehow, liked him back. Marena lit no candles. She drew a low wooden bench out from beneath the altar and dusted it with the edge of her glove and gestured for Sable to sit, and Maren sat across from her on a second bench. For a long moment the High Mistress of the Pale Court did not speak. She looked at Callum. She had not touched him. She had not asked to touch him. She had only ever looked at him, and Sable, who had been a kitchen girl long enough to read the difference between hunger and reverence in a person's face, understood now that what she had taken for greed in Maren's eyes this morning had not been greed at all. It had been recognition. "Tell me what he is," Sable said. Maren lifted her gray eyes from Callum's face. "What do you know," she said, "about the Pale Court?" "Almost nothing. Stories. My grandmother said they were women who spoke to wolves before there were kings of wolves. She said they kept the moon, and the moon kept them." "Your grandmother was almost right." Maren's mouth softened briefly. "The Pale Court is older than the wolf kings. We were the women who carried the first oath between humans and the moon, before there were alphas, before there were packs, before there were crowns. Every wolf king who has ever sat on a throne in 5 kingdoms sits there because a pale sister, somewhere in his bloodline, said he could. Aldrich of Marrowvale's line is the oldest unbroken bloodline we have ever made. We have watched his house for 400 years, Mistress Winfair, and in all that time, we have never once seen what we are seeing now." She looked at Callum. "His son," she said, "is the first child born of an alpha king and a pale-blooded woman in 400 years." Sable went very still. "I am not pale-blooded. You are. My grandmother was a healer in the river country." "Your grandmother," Marene said, "was the last living daughter of the eastern house of the Pale Court, which was burned to the ground by the 3rd king of the Crowns 112 years ago. She survived because she was 4 years old, and a kitchen girl hid her in a salt barrel for 3 days. She lived the rest of her life in hiding. She married a fisherman and bore 1 daughter and 1 granddaughter, and she taught both of them everything she could remember about herbs and bone and breath, and she never told either of them whose blood they carried, because she had sworn on the night of the burning that she would let the line die quietly rather than let the crowns find it again. I respected that oath. I watched your line for 3 generations and did nothing. And then your king found you in his herb garden when you were 16 years old, and he marked you when you were 17, and you conceived his child in the autumn of your 19th year, and the moon herself sat up and noticed. I came down out of the pale court the next morning. I have been in the palace ever since, watching you carry the heir to 2 thrones in a kitchen girl's apron and trying to keep you alive long enough to deliver him. Sable could not speak. She put her hand on the back of Callum's small dark head, and he turned his face into her palm, and she understood that the small life she had carried out of Hyruk in a torn slipper was not what she had thought he was at all. She had thought she was running with a king's bastard. She had been running with the heir to the oldest line in the world. Aldrich does not know. He does not. I have known, and I have not told him, because if I had told him, he would have done exactly what he did anyway, and he would have done it louder, and we would have lost you both. I have told him, in the letter that summoned him here, that there is a thing about the boy he must hear from me. I have not told him what the thing is. I will tell him tomorrow at dusk, when he arrives, with you in the room. Why are you telling me first? Because you are the boy's mother, and you are pale-blooded, and the court has not had a daughter of the Eastern House in 12 decades. And the moment your king walks through that door tomorrow, I will be standing in a room with the only 2 living people in 5 kingdoms who outrank me. Sable looked at her. You outrank me, Sable said slowly. By blood, yes. The Eastern House is the senior house of the Pale Court. It has been empty for 112 years. The chair has been waiting. Marena folded her hands. I am not asking you to fill it. I am telling you that the chair exists, and that your son exists, and that these 2 facts together mean the Pale Court is about to be very loud, Mistress Winfair, and we are going to be loud on your behalf. Sable did not sleep that night. She nursed Callum at the 2nd hour, and he slept against her chest, and she sat on the bench in the warm chapel with her son's breath rising and falling against her collarbone, and she let herself, for the first time in her life, think about what she was. A daughter of an old burned house, the mother of an heir to 2 thrones, the bonded mate of the Alpha King of Marrowvale, who had spent his name to keep her breathing, and who was riding through the dark right now toward a chapel he did not know existed. She pressed her hand to her hip in the warm dark. The mark answered. He was close, much closer than this morning. He had crossed the lowland fog. He had crossed the river country. He was on the salt road now, somewhere out in the night between her and Hyruk, and the bond was no longer humming. The bond was pulling. A steady, hard, hand-over-hand pull, the way a man pulls himself up a rope toward a window he has been told is the only way out of a burning house. She closed her eyes. She let him pull. And somewhere in the dark south of Cinder Marsh, in a copse of wind-bent pines on the salt road, the king of Marrowvale lifted his head from where he had stopped to water his horse and turned his face, very precisely, toward the chapel that warmed itself. He smiled. It was the first time in 4 months that Aldrich of Marrowvale had smiled with his whole face, and his men, who had been watching him for that smile without knowing they were watching for it, exchanged a single look among themselves and tightened the girths on their saddles without being told. And in the warm dark of the Salt Pan Chapel, Sable Winfair, last daughter of the Eastern House of the Pale Court, opened her eyes in the dark and whispered to the stone walls the only sentence she had left. Come home, my love. We have so much to tell you. He came at the hour the Salt Flat people called low gold. It was the hour when the sun lay flat across the hollow sea and turned the salt crust the color of an old coin. Sable stood inside the chapel with her hand pressed to the warm stone of the wall, and her son asleep in his sling against her chest, and she felt him before she heard him. The bond on her hip went still. Not silent. Not gone. Still, the way water goes still when it has finally arrived at the cup it was poured for. He had stopped riding. He was walking up the rise toward the chapel door. She did not move. She had thought she would run to the door when he came. She had been wrong. He had been at the other end of the bond for 4 months, and the bond was about to be a hand on her face for the first time. And she did not, she found, want to meet that hand standing up. She moved to the bench in front of the altar and she sat, and she put her hand on the back of her son's small dark head, and she waited. Maren, who had been at the high window watching the salt road for the last hour, turned and stopped beside Sable's bench. He has crossed the threshold of the rise. The chapel is shielding the boy from his scent. He will not feel his son until the door opens. I want you to know that, so that when his face changes, you will understand what changed. Sable nodded. She did not trust her voice. The lock on the chapel door turned itself. The door swung inward, and the long, pale stripe of low gold light from the salt flats came in across the stone, and a man stepped through it with his head bent under the lintel and his cloak gathered in one fist at his shoulder, and Sable Winfair, who had spent 4 months teaching herself to think about nothing, looked at the king of Marrowvale across 30 feet of warm chapel stone and forgot, all at once, every discipline she had ever learned. He had got thinner. He had been a broad man whose shoulders had filled the doorway of his private chamber. He was still broad, but he had got thinner, in the way a sword gets thinner when it has been sharpened too many times. There were hollows beneath his cheekbones. There was gray at his temples that had not been there 4 months ago. There was a scar across the left side of his jaw that she had not given him. His eyes were the same, amber, like his son's, like the inside of a candle flame, like every dusk she had ever stood in. He saw her. He saw the bench. He saw her hand on the back of Callum's head. He saw the small dark hair beneath her palm. He saw the shape of the sling against her chest, and his eyes dropped to it, and his breath caught in his throat in a sound that she felt rather than heard, and his face did the thing Maren had warned her about. It changed. Changed, the way a landscape changes when a long frozen river finally cracks. Every line of him reorganized in one breath around the new fact that the small life she had carried out of his palace was not a small life anymore, was not theoretical, was not a hope, or a fear, or a thing he was going to meet in a future he had stopped letting himself imagine. The small life was a person. The small life had hair. The small life was breathing in a sling against his mate's chest in a chapel his bond had pulled him to across 200 miles of salt road. Aldrich of Marrowvale dropped his cloak. He crossed the chapel in 7 long strides. He stopped 3 paces from her bench. He went down on one knee on the warm stone, very slowly, and he put his hands flat on his own thighs because she could see he did not trust them, and he said in a voice she had heard once in 4 months, in a letter, signed Aldrich, "May I see him?" Sable's hands were shaking. She unwrapped the sling. She lifted her son out of it, and she turned him so that his face came into the long pale stripe of low gold light. And Callum, who had slept through the bond going still and the door opening, opened his amber eyes at exactly the moment his father's eyes met them. He looked at his father. His father looked at him. Neither of them moved. For a long beat in the warm chapel, the only sound was the wind outside and Sable's own breath. And then Callum opened his mouth and made a small, bright sound, a greeting, a noise that had no word in it, but was unmistakably the noise of a person who had recognized another person. Aldrich of Marrowvale put his face in his hands and wept. He wept silently, on his knees, 3 paces from his mate and his son. He did not ask to come closer. He did not reach for the boy. He did not reach for Sable. He simply knelt and wept. And Sable, who had thought she had no tears left in her this morning, found out she had been wrong. After a long while, he lowered his hands. His face was wet. He did not wipe it. His name. Callum. Callum. He tested it. He nodded once. Callum. May I hold him? Sable nodded. She could not speak. He came up off his knee and crossed the last 3 paces to the bench, and he sat down beside her, and she lifted Callum into his hands. The king of Marrow Vale took his son into his arms with the careful terror of a man being handed something made of glass, and Callum looked up into his father's face and made the small bright sound a second time and curled his small fist into the front of his father's torn cloak and held on. Aldrich bent his head over his son and breathed. Sable put her hand on the center of his back, between his shoulder blades, where she had used to rest her cheek in stolen hours, and he turned his head into her hair without looking up from his son. I am so sorry. I am so sorry, my love. Hush. I should have come sooner. You came when it was safe to come. Hush. His hand found hers, the one she had laid against his back, and he lifted it and turned it over and pressed his mouth to her palm, and the bond on her hip, which had been still since the moment he crossed the threshold, broke open. It was not pain. It was a bell rung in a tower that had been muffled with cloth. It was every night she had spent pretending the warmth in her hip was a phantom, every time she had told herself she would survive being half a thing. It was all of those returned to her in one single rolling beat, and she gasped against his shoulder, and she felt, through the bond, the answering rolling beat of his own 4 months. And it was bearable, because he was bearing it beside her, and because the small warm weight in his arms was breathing. He spoke first, eventually, without lifting his eyes from Callum. The Crowns took the river country last month. The Cliff Lords are coming for Hyruk within the fortnight. I am, technically, no longer a king. You are a king. By bond, perhaps. Not by treaty. By bond is older. He looked up at her at last. By bond is older, he repeated very softly. Yes, my love. By bond is older. He turned with his son in his arms and looked across the chapel at Maren. Hi, mistress. Maren turned from the window. She had been crying too, very quietly. She crossed the stone floor and stopped at the foot of their bench, and she inclined her head to the king of Marrow Vale, and he inclined his head back to her. You said in your letter, he said, that there is a thing about the boy I must hear from you. Yes. Tell me. Maren told him. She told him about the eastern house and the burning. She told him about Sable's grandmother and the salt barrel and the kept oath. She told him about the 400 years of watching and the chair that had been waiting for 112 years, and the fact that the small warm weight in his arms was the heir to 2 thrones, and not the smaller of the 2. Aldrich listened. He did not interrupt. He did not flinch. He looked the whole time at his son's sleeping face, and when Mareni finished he was silent for a long count of 10, and then he said, My grandmother used to say there were women older than the kings. Your grandmother was right. She used to say the moon owed our line one debt that had not yet been called in. And now it has been called in, Maren said. He looked at Sable. He looked down at Callum. He looked back at Maren. What do you need from us? She told him that the Cliff Lords riding for Hyruk would not reach Hyruk because the Pale Court was going to meet them on the Salt Road 3 days from now in open colors. That the 5 crowns would, after that, sue for terms. That the terms would be, the boy lives, the bond stands, the burned house is restored, and the chair is filled. That none of this could happen unless the bond between him and Sable was completed before the court rode out. Aldrich's hand on Callum's back went still. He looked at Sable. He did not ask the question with his mouth. He asked it with his face, and Sable lifted her free hand and laid her fingers along the line of his jaw, just under the scar, and turned his face the small distance toward hers. Yes, she said. Of course, yes. Tonight. Aldrich closed his eyes. He pressed his forehead against hers. Maren, with her gray eyes shining, inclined her head a third time and walked the length of the chapel and out the door. And she left the king of Marrow Vale and the last daughter of the eastern house, and their sleeping son alone in the warm stone for the first hour of their unbroken life. The bell in the salt pan chapel tower rang once at sunset. It was the first time it had rung in 200 years. The bond was completed at the second hour of the night. Sable did not have words afterwards for what it was. There were no words in her grandmother's old book, and no words in any language Marina had taught her. And she did not need words in the end, because the bond itself had taken the place of language between them. It was the unmuffling of a bell. For 4 months she had heard him through cloth. She heard him now without cloth. She heard the boy in the herb garden and the king on the dais, and the man who had spent his name, and the wolf he had been holding, and the tired creature who had wept on his knees in the warm stone. And she heard them all at once, in a single chord, and she gave him back the chord she had been hiding from herself. All of her, all at once, in a single answering note that he received with his whole body and his whole bond and his whole tired, beautiful, exhausted heart. When it was done, they lay together on the cloak he had dropped at the door, with their son asleep 3 paces away in his basket, and Aldrich pressed his mouth to the mark on her hip and said, against her skin, I am never going to be far enough away from you again to need a bond to find you, my love. And they slept, the 3 of them in the warm stone, for the first full, unbroken night either of the adults had slept in 4 months. The pale court rode at dawn 3 days later. They came up the salt road from the south in long, quiet ranks, 200 women on gray horses, their cloaks the color of pearl, their hair plaited in the old Eastern style, and the salt-flat people came out of their houses to watch them pass, and not one of them spoke. The salt-flat people had thought the pale court was a story their grandmothers had told. The salt-flat people learned, that morning, that some stories were rooms you had been living in without knowing it. Marina rode at the head. Sable rode beside her on a smaller gray horse, with Callum bound to her chest in the same length of mended wool she had used to carry him out of her cellar a week before. She wore pearl now, instead of gray wool. She had understood, putting it on, that the chair had been filled the moment she had said yes to her king on the warm stone bench. Aldrich rode on Sable's other side. He had been given a fresh cloak. He had been given 6 more wolves out of the pale court's own kennels, 6 creatures the size of small horses with eyes the color of the moon, and he rode with his back straight for the first time since the convocation. They met the cliff lords on the open salt at noon. There were 1,200 men on the cliff lords' side. There were 200 women and 1 king, and 6 moon-eyed wolves on the pale court's side. The cliff lords laughed when they saw the count. They stopped laughing when Maren raised her gloved hand. What happened on the salt that afternoon was not a battle. It was a correction. Sable held her son against her chest and watched Maren speak in the language no one alive could translate. And she watched the cliff lords' horses refuse, one by one, to move forward. And she watched the cliff lord's commander dismount in the middle of the salt and walk toward Maren and kneel in the crust of the flat and offer his sword to her gloved hand. Maren did not take the sword. She gestured to her left. The cliff lord rose and walked the further pale walk, and knelt a second time and offered his sword to Sable Winfair instead. Sable took it. She took the sword across her free palm with her son's small, warm weight against her chest, and the cliff lord looked up at her face, and his face did the thing Aldrich's had done in the chapel. It changed. He understood, kneeling in the salt crust at noon, that the burned house was not burned anymore. By dusk, the 5 crowns had requested terms. By the end of the week, Aldrich of Marrowvale rode back through the gates of his own palace with his mate at his side, and his son in her arms, and the high mistress of the pale court 3 paces behind him, and the nobles who had watched him spend his name on a kitchen girl 4 months ago stood in the same hall and watched him put a pearl-gray cloak over the kitchen girl's shoulders with his own hands, and not one of them opened their mouths. The treaty that was eventually signed was not the treaty the convocation had wanted. It was a better one. It held for 47 years. The woman in dove-colored silk who had watched Sable run from a doorway in the colonnade was found 3 months later in a private chamber in the Salt Cliffs with a single line of pearl thread tied around her wrist. She was a crown agent, in service to the Lord of the Salt Cliffs. The pearl thread was the pale court's mark of judgment. She lived out the rest of her natural life in a small stone house on the eastern moor, healing children's fevers for free because the pale court had given her one small fragment of its old work to do as the price of her continued breathing. Callum learned to walk in the herb garden where his father had once corrected a 16-year-old kitchen girl about bitterthorn. He did it on a summer morning, in front of 3 watching wolves and 1 weeping mother, and 1 king who had pretended he was not weeping. The boy let go of the wooden bench and took 4 small staggering steps across the stones, with his small fists open at his shoulders, and he reached his father's outstretched hands, and his father lifted him into the air, and his father said, in the voice he kept only for his son and his mate, and the moon, "Well done, Callum of Marrow Vale, well done, my brave one." A daughter came 2 years later. She was named Winna, after Sable's burned house. She had her father's dark hair and her mother's grandmother's gray eyes, and the bond between her parents brightened a 3rd time. The 3rd child, a boy named Wren, was born in the Salt Pan Chapel on a winter evening when his mother had insisted on traveling there to deliver him. The chapel had warmed itself for his arrival, and the small bell in the tower had rung itself a 2nd time when he drew his first breath. And the Salt Flat people had again stopped what they were doing and looked up. And this time, most of them had known why. On the 40th anniversary of the night Aldrich of Marrowvale had spent his name in his own throne hall, the king and his mate stood together at the high window of the same hall, no longer young, and watched the lamps being lit along the lower colonnade for the convocation of their grandson's marriage. Sable's hair had gone the color of polished pewter. Aldrich's was almost entirely silver now, except at his temples, where it remained, stubbornly, the dark brown she had first run her hand through in a kitchen garden a lifetime ago. The mark on her hip had healed long since into a small silver scar in the shape of a crescent bracketed by 2 stars. The matching scar on his throat had healed into the same shape. He stood behind her at the window with his arms around her waist and his chin on the top of her head, and he said, in the voice he kept only for her, "Do you remember, my love, the lower colonnade?" "I remember." "You were going to be on a horse by now." "I was. The horse, I am told, was sold the next week to a fishmonger for half what it was worth." "A grave injustice." "A great one." He turned her in his arms and he looked down into her face, and he said very quietly, "I have one regret. I should have spoken your name a year sooner. I lost a year being careful." Sable put her hand against the side of his face. "You did not lose it," she said. "You spent it, carefully, on keeping me alive long enough to be the woman who could carry what you were going to give me when you finally said it. You did not lose a year, my love. You bought the rest of them." He pressed his forehead to hers, the way he had pressed it in a warm chapel a lifetime ago. Below them, in the lower colonnade, the lamps came up one by one. In the throne hall behind them, the drums of the convocation began. And in the great long memory of the kingdom of Marrowvale, the story would be told for 400 years that there had been, once, a king who had loved a kitchen girl, and a kitchen girl who had walked out of a palace with a child no one knew about, and a pale court that had sat up in answer, and a name that had been spent in a throne hall on a single night to save a single life. The name they had spoken in the throne hall had cost a treaty. The name they had spoken in the throne hall had bought a world, And in the warm dark of every winter night for the rest of their long lives, Aldrich of Merrowvale and Sable of the Eastern House lay together with the bond unmuffled between them and 3 sleeping children in the rooms beyond. And they did not, either of them, ever again say the small old name that meant the thing my heart returns to, because they no longer needed to. They were already home.